It is Indiana in the Morning, presented as always by First Commonwealth Bank here on WCCS 101.1 FM and AM 1160. And what a privilege it is to talk to Peter Stark, the author of Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. And especially, we get to this time of the year, Memorial Day, the 4th of July coming up, and we get to talk about, well, something that's very near literally to us in our region, because General Washington, when he was a young man, spent so much time right here. And Peter Stark, you've actually spent some time in this neighborhood to write this amazing book. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good to talk to you, Todd. I have spent some time right in that very neighborhood researching the book about when George Washington was in his 20s, especially his early 20s, and a lot of it happens right around where you are.
One of the great aspects of the book is it's a different George Washington than, I don't want to say than we've been taught, but that we've come to know, because we have this very staid image of the very dignified General Washington. He was a different guy when he was young, just like all of us.
Just like all of us, that's exactly right. That he didn't become General Washington until he was 43 years old. So before that, he'd had about 15 years as a tobacco planter in Virginia, married to Martha. And before that, he was thrashing around in the wilderness of the Ohio Valley. The years I write about, these are in his early 20s, and in your area. And he was a very ambitious young man, and he was thin-skinned and prickly and proud and crossways with his boss, and he had a lot going on.
Well, one of the interesting things about it, this phrase wouldn't have existed back then, but he kept his foot on the gas pedal when he was young, because he really, you use the word ambition, he was eager to get into, so much of what he ended up being. And what he did when he was a young man really informed the differences between that young man and George Washington the Elder.
Yes, that's exactly right. And as a young man, he was a real striver. He was pushing forward all the time to make a name for himself. And in a way that reveals, this period of his life is more revealing about him than, the staid George Washington we know, the statue. He's like sort of fully born as a great leader, a flawless great leader. That's the image that we have. But this young man was really ambitious, really striving. He'd come from a family of the Virginia tobacco planting society, but a kind of a middling family. They were more like farmers rather than these great plantation owners with hundreds of slaves and the great houses and thousands of acres of tobacco. So, and George's father died when he was 11, and most of the father's land went to George's older half-brother. So that left him needing a way to make a living. His mom wouldn't let him go to sea at age 14. He took up surveying, and he taught himself to survey. He didn't have much formal education, but he taught himself to survey and ended up surveying some of the frontier lands, kind of the frontier of Virginia on the other side of the mountains from where you all are. And through that experience, he gained this kind of, frontier backcountry experience. He made some money. He bought some land. And he eventually, at age 21, still trying to make a name for himself, very much trying to make a name for himself, he joined the Virginia military kind of on a part-time basis. And the Virginia governor, or the British governor of Virginia, sent him on an important mission over the Appalachian Mountains, over the Alleghenies, as you call them in your region, mm-hmm. to a French fort way back in the Ohio Valley wilderness, and to deliver a message to the French commandant back there, saying, "This is the king's land. This is King George's land. Stay out." Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of George's appearance on the public screen.
Those formative military experiences, and especially that one, you write so detailed about that particular journey into the wilderness of Ohio. And I don't think we have an appreciation until we read something such as you've written of what that experience would be like, the challenges of the travel alone, especially at that time of the year, and then basically marching right into French territory, even though that was the heart of the dispute, by himself with a few traveling companions, and delivering a letter that I'm sure the French knew was basically throwing down the gauntlet. Yeah,
you're right. I mean, it was an extraordinary journey, and at age 21 in the winter. And that's in the book. That's one of the things I've really tried to do is make that sort of experience as vivid as possible. These really rugged experiences he went through as a young man, almost dying several times in the wilderness. And I come at this from a personal point of view that I've written a lot about adventure and exploration, and I've done a lot of adventuring myself, and some pretty dicey stuff, paddling down unpaddled rivers in Africa and hanging out with hunters, Inuit hunters in northern Greenland. And I have a background in wilderness in a way, and travel in the wilderness, and I really understand what it's like to cross mountains in the winter, to camp in a tent in the winter on mountains, struggle through snowstorms. At one point, George and his companion, his wilderness guide, are stopped by a half-frozen river, the Allegheny, in fact, right, probably about 30 miles from where you are. Mm-hmm. And they're forced to construct a makeshift raft using one dull hatchet, and they work all day on this raft, and they shove off just at dusk. They think they're being chased by Indians at this point, so they're very much in a hurry to get across this river. And they get out into the middle of the river, and there are ice floes running down the river, big ice floes. The current's running very quickly, very swiftly, and George is trying to pole the raft, push it with a pole, mm-hmm. and an ice floe catches the raft and the pole, and it catapults George right off the raft into these swirling ice floes, and he comes very close to dying right there. Unfortunately, he makes it back onto the raft, and they get to an island, and the Christopher Gist gets a fire going. The guide gets a fire going, and George, they make it through the night, but it's a really dicey situation. Yeah. And there are any number of times like that where Washington goes through these experiences, and it really did shape him for the great leader that he would one day become.
Peter Stark is our guest. The book is Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. And we're talking about George Washington as a young man. The French and Indian War, of course, his military exploits here in our region during the French and Indian War probably wouldn't have had to occur had it not been for an incident that he directly touched off.
Yes. And I go into quite vivid detail about that in the book. That he, after he delivered Governor Dinwiddie's message to the French commandant received him very formally, and the French commandant was this elderly, distinguished gentleman, and gave him a formal dinner and wine and the best meats and whatnot. And then the French commandant wrote a letter in response to Governor Dinwiddie, and Washington and Christopher Gist, the guide, struggle through the snowy wilderness for weeks. They finally abandon their horses because there's not enough forage for the horses, and the streams are frozen. The horses can't drink. They struggle back over the mountains, deliver the message to Governor Dinwiddie, and the message essentially says, as to the request for us to leave, actually it says first, very politely, our two nations are at peace, France and England and Britain, but we would very much like to maintain that peace. But as to the request that you send for us to leave, I don't think so. And so Governor Dinwiddie, this British merchant, is enraged, and Washington is indignant. And so Governor Dinwiddie, and you have to remember George. He's 21 at this point. He's just turning 22. So Governor Dinwiddie sends George back into the wilderness, the Ohio wilderness, very close to where you are, at the head of a small military party, with a firmer message to the French, and Washington gets back in there, and Governor Dinwiddie is also giving him instructions to don't be the aggressor and use caution. And Washington is, such a ambitious, striving young man. He promptly ignores both pieces of advice, and he comes across a small party of French who are camped in a wooded glen. This is now known as Jumonville Glen. It's very close to Uniontown, very near where you all are. Yeah. And Washington is convinced that this French party is out to attack him. And even though there's really not any solid evidence of that whatsoever. And so Washington comes sneaking up on this party, sneaking over the edge of the glen at one rainy dawn, and all his men with their muskets drawn. And there's some confusion about just what happened, but Washington gives the order to open fire. These French guys are having breakfast down in the glen. There's a lot of them are asleep. It ends up being a slaughter of the French in the Glen, and the French claim that they're a diplomatic party trying to deliver a message to Washington. Mm. Well, in the course of this melee, there's an Indian allied with Washington. He's commonly known as the Half King. Yeah. He goes up to the French officer in charge who's wounded, and he comes up behind the French officer in charge, and he slams his tomahawk down on the French officer's head, splits open his skull, pulls out his brains, washes it through his hands, and this, you can see, would not go over well with the French.
No.
Washington, in this case, instead of pausing and considering what he might do, he forges ahead. He very cockily says, I enjoy the sound of bullets whistling, and if the French put up no more resistance than this, I'll drive them all the way back to Montreal. Well, it ends up that Washington and his men get slaughtered, and this is at Fort Necessity, again, right in your neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And these end up being the opening events of the French and Indian War.
A few moments left with Peter Stark, the author of Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. You do us the favor as well of getting away from the woods and the battlefield and into Washington in a social way. He's in love with another person's wife. You talk about that a lot, and it's the real story of a young guy growing into himself. And in that day and age, it was a whole different set of challenges than today's, and yet some of those issues remain even in today's young men. And it's yes. Interesting to watch that develop and watch him develop into the guy he eventually became.
Yeah. He, as he goes along, you can see these not exactly. There are certain moments, but there's a growing sense of a greater world and a growing sense of empathy in him towards his men, then towards the frontier settlers he's supposed to be protecting from Indian attacks, and they're pleading him to protect them, and it's really hard to do. And then he also survives the great battle where you are, Braddock's defeat, mm-hmm. As a unquestionably brave. I mean, amazingly brave. He was always amazingly brave. And where everybody else is getting slaughtered, the officers are mowed down, he survives, and he's running around on the battlefield delivering orders from General Braddock. He ends up surviving the battle with 4 bullet holes through his hat and coat, just amazingly. And he, on the basis of that experience, becomes convinced that divine providence is saving him for some other role, and that plants in his mind this idea that he has this greater role in life. That's you can see the germination of that. So these are some of the influences that go into beginning to shape him as a person who's concerned a lot less just about George and more about people around him. And then when he marries Martha, who's the richest widow in Virginia, the British pry the French out of the Ohio wilderness, and George immediately leaves and goes back to Virginia, marries Martha, this very wealthy widow, and that establishes him socially. He's right at the top of the hierarchy now, having married Martha, and I also think so he doesn't have to thrash around so much to make a name. And I also think, again, this is interpretation, this part is, but that I believe that Martha gave him a lot of emotional reassurance that he didn't have when he was a young man in his early 20s. And I think, like so many of us, we find a companion, a mate who really can help us activate in the world in a way, give us a sense of stability and reassurance. And I think Martha really did that for him.
He is Peter Stark. The book is Young Washington, How Wilderness and War Forged America's Founding Father. A wonderful read. I love the style, the narrative style, and I want to thank you for spending some time with us here this morning on Indiana in the Morning.
Thank you so much, Todd, and thank you to all the people in your region who were so helpful and welcoming when I came through there researching this book. So I really enjoyed your part of the world.